to start by thanking Berlin Books for taking a chance on a completely unknown American author. And also, but most importantly, I need to thank Peter Crabtree, the esteemed historian, without whose help, I guarantee you I would not be standing here today speaking in the shadow of the greatest golf club in the world. So I'm very grateful to Peter and always will be. And now let's begin. The man you see pictured behind me is Andrew Kirkcaldy, a colorful caddy who grew up to be a feared player and a beloved character in golf. His memoir includes a chapter that takes readers on a tour of dear old St. Andrews. It begins with this invitation: come with me to the cathedral burial ground, and I will show you a strange thing, the like of which is not to be seen anywhere that I know of. There stands the monument to young Tommy Morris, with a carved lifelike figure of himself in the act of addressing the ball. A memorial in the kirkyard to a golfer. Long before I read Andrew's memoir, I made my first pilgrimage to St. Andrews. I too stood in front of that imposing memorial with the dashing young man in the Glengarry bonnet staring down at me. Tommy's monument towers over every grave in that ancient burial ground. It can be seen at a distance from many vantage points in the cemetery. What caught my eye, however, was the last line of its inscription. This monument has been erected by contributions from 60 golfing societies. That left me as amazed as Andrew, just for different reasons. 60 golfing societies amounted to nearly every club that existed during Tommy's age. It raised a question I couldn't shake, the question that set me on the long journey that brings me here today. Why would gentlemen from every golf club in the kingdom dip into their own pockets to build a memorial to a young man born to the working class? The answer, it turns out, is this: those men had lived through one of those rare moments in history where genius meets opportunity and nothing is ever the same. They felt duty-bound, as men have through the ages, to make certain the world will never forget how Tommy had transformed the game they loved. Tommy grew up at a pivotal moment for golf. He was born just 3 years after the most significant development in the game's history: the invention of the first hard rubber ball. The gutty, as that ball was known, was made of gutta percha, a gummy substance that comes from the sap of trees that grow in Malaysia. It replaced the feathery, a ball that had been in use for 200 years. Featheries were made of leather stuffed with hen, duck, or goose down. They were extremely difficult to manufacture, extraordinarily fragile, and prohibitively expensive. Only men of means could afford to play the game with the proper ball. Young boys in Scotland still played, of course, but they used a champagne cork for a ball and whatever they could fashion into a rudimentary club. The arrival of the cheap and durable gutty made golf affordable to everyone and drew thousands of new players to the links. Golf was ripe for change. It was during that transformative moment that young Tommy came of age. In a mere 10 years, as one dazzling performance followed another, his genius for golf and his swashbuckling personality transformed a game that had been frozen in amber for centuries. Tommy set in motion 3 fundamental changes that continued to reverberate long after he had taken his last swing. He revolutionized the way golf was played. He introduced a new idea of what a professional golfer could be and how much one could earn at a time when his brethren were considered feckless, reckless creatures. And he ignited a spark that would spread golf to England and eventually, like wildfire, to every corner of the globe. The story of how all this unfolded begins here in St. Andrews, where Tommy was born in April of 1851. He was named after his father, who ran a club and ball-making shop and was one of Scotland's most famous golfers. Just 3 years after Tommy's birth, the family moved to Prestwick on the west coast. His father had been lured there to design a proper golf course and become keeper of the green. Tommy spent his formative years in Prestwick learning his golf on that classic Scottish course. He was 13 when the Royal and Ancient Golf Club brought his father back home to care for the famed links at St. Andrews. Young Tommy and his family would spend the rest of their lives in this old grey town by the sea. Like most Scottish boys, Tommy would have been taking his first swings with a cut-down club as soon as he could walk. Apparently, it was evident early on that he would be a golfer of a different caliber. Tommy was not quite 13 years old when his father decided that he was ready for public competition. The two of them traveled north to Perth, where young Tom was to play in an amateur event associated with the Perth Open Tournament of 1864. Perth was the first city to catch the fever for professional stroke play tournaments that spread throughout Scotland after Prestwick started the Open Championship in 1860. Up to that time, golf had been almost exclusively a match play game, foursomes especially. Golfers in that era had no interest in grinding out a low score the way players do today. They considered that boring. What they craved was the thrust and parry of a match and the life and death drama it created. A 36-hole match was considered the true test of a champion. Better still was a great match, a competition featuring several days of 36 holes apiece, often over different golf courses. The Open Championship and the professional tournaments that sprang up in its wake were the first signs that golf would evolve from the match play culture of that age into the stroke play game that predominates today. The committee in charge of the Perth Open decided, even then, that young Tommy was no amateur, and they barred him from competing in the amateur event. The assembled professionals had absolutely zero interest in playing against a mere boy with a reputation. Instead, a match was found for Tommy against a young man his own age, a local star named William Gregg. Those who saw Tommy's performance that afternoon described it as astonishing. His match against Gregg was followed by a crowd far larger than the one that had followed the professional players the previous day. Everyone at Perth that afternoon understood that in young Tom Morris, they had witnessed the coming of a prodigy. When the professionals gathered for a photograph to commemorate that event, Tommy was invited to pose with them. That spoke volumes about the respect he had earned as a player. You can see young Tom there in the upper left-hand corner, wearing his Sunday best and clutching an iron. He stares directly at the camera. The fierce intensity that would be the hallmark of his career is already evident in Tommy's eyes. Years later, a poet would describe it as the light of triumph. This, in my opinion, is the most telling image ever taken of young Tom. Tommy grew up at a time when leading golfers of the day, men like his father and Alan Robertson, played a game as different from modern power golf as you can imagine. Their games are probably best described by the old Scots word "pawky." It means cunning in wit or strategy. Men like Alan and Tom took slow, sweeping swings. Their goal was to maneuver the ball carefully around the course's hazards on the way to making a tidy score. Their mantra was, "Don't press. Stay within yourself." Tommy had no use for such maxims. His plan on every shot was to attack, and attack fiercely. Tommy's slashing swing had such a furious follow-through that he was nearly swept off his feet. Often as not, his Glengarry bonnet went sailing into the hands of an adoring fan. The fans loved it, and so did Tommy. Tommy could go all out on every shot because he knew no fear of hazards. He loved the challenge of an impossible shot, and his ability to recover from desperate trouble has been matched only by the likes of Walter Hagen or Seve Ballesteros. Tommy played with such dash and bravado that he was as intimidating as Tiger Woods in his prime. Tommy was, in essence, the forerunner of the power players who dominate golf today. It was not simply his strategy that set Tommy apart, however. His tactics were different too. The arrival of the gutty ball presented new possibilities for how golf could be played. No one took advantage of them more aggressively than Tommy did. Up to that time, Because of the delicacy of the feather ball, the game had been played almost exclusively with long-nosed wooden clubs. Most players carried only a single iron, a stubby-faced club known as a rut iron. It got that name because it was used to pop the ball out of hazards, like the deep ruts that were left behind by carts that wheeled themselves over the open links. It's not hard to understand why irons were confined to that purpose. Just imagine for a second what would happen if a feather ball were mishit with an iron. The golfer would look like he just lost a pillow fight, with feathers flying everywhere, and a little heap of leather down at his feet. The gutty could withstand the pounding of iron clubs, and it was Tommy who first seized the opportunities the ball presented for revolutionizing the way golf was played. He began routinely playing shots to the green with his rut iron, hitting shots that soared high and stopped quickly. We see that shot every week now on a professional tour. Tommy couldn't make the ball spin backwards the way modern players do. His irons were smooth-faced. No one had yet thought of the idea of adding grooves to them to make the ball spin. Allen Robertson had been the first to try that lofty iron shot. He was such a precise player, scientific as his friends would say, that he could nip a feathery with an iron and pop it onto the green. But Tommy perfected the shot and brought it into everyday use. These changes spurred the development and use of iron clubs into the next century and beyond, changing the game forever. Tommy also had a new idea about how to play a ball sitting 10 or 15 yards off the putting surface with a clear path to the hole. Before Tommy came along, the routine play was to take out a wooden putter and give the ball a good rap toward the hole. That plan of attack, of course, meant that any rough patch of ground along the way could send the shot offline. Tommy solved that problem by carrying a short, straight-faced iron he called the jigger. He used it to chip the ball onto the green and let it race for the hole. And even today, that bump and run shot remains an essential weapon in the arsenal of every links golfer. If these daring shots struck fear into his opponents, it was his putting that broke their hearts. Tommy was the deadliest putter of his age, and perhaps of any other. He holed an uncanny number of putts from across the green, and almost never missed from short range. His confidence in his stroke was absolute. Tommy didn't walk his putts into the hole the way modern players do. He was a bit more cocksure than them. While his ball was still rolling, Tommy would look over to his caddy and say, "Pick it out of the hole, laddie," and then stride confidently off the green to watch the ball drop in just as he predicted. Tommy played professionally for only a decade, from his Open debut in 1865 at the age of 14 until his tragic death on Christmas Day 10 years later. But during that meteoric career, he established a standard of performance that marks him as the first of the game's immortals. He set 2 records unmatched to this day. He remains the youngest person to win a major championship at age 17, and he is the only player to have won the Open 4 times in succession, a record that I feel confident will stand for all time. He also held the scoring record at the 2 most important venues played in his lifetime: 77 at St. Andrews, which he tied with Jamie Anderson, and later his own brother, and 47 for the 12 holes at Prestwick. Tommy's 3rd consecutive victory in the Open helped secure the future of golf's oldest and greatest championship. It earned him the right to keep the belt, the tournament's original trophy, as his personal property. But more important, it sparked a year-long debate that resulted in St. Andrews and Musselburgh joining Prestwick as hosts to the Open. That was the beginning of the modern championship rota. Together, the clubs purchased a new golf champions trophy, better known today as the Claret Jug. When that trophy was played for in the fall of 1872, Tommy won again and became the first player to have his name engraved on the game's most cherished prize. Tommy's performance in winning the belt in 1870 is as great as any in the history of this game. In those days, the Open consisted of 3 trips around the treacherous 12-hole links at Prestwick, 36 holes in all. Tommy needed just 149 shots. Now let's stop and think about that for a minute. Tommy played with a handful of clubs we would consider primitive. Anyone who has ever swung a club from that era, as I have done, knows that they were vastly more difficult to hit, with a sweet spot the size of a small coin. Tommy used a ball that seldom flew as far as 200 yards. And he played on a links vastly more rugged than the manicured courses of today. Yet, Tommy made a score equivalent to 18-hole rounds of 74 and 75. I can assure you, there will be many players at Portrush in the championship next week who will not do as well as that. Tommy's 149 was a full 15 strokes below the average winning score of the 10 previous Opens. Can you imagine how dispiriting it must have been to compete against golf like that? I often wonder how poor Bob Kirk felt after finishing second in that Open. His score of 161 would have been good enough to win 7 of the 10 previous championships, and yet he found himself 12 strokes behind Tommy. It wasn't simply the scores that left Tommy's opponent slack-jawed. He also had the superstar's flair for the dramatic. In 1869, he made the first Open and hole-in-one in Open history. The following year, Tommy began his quest to claim the belt as his own with an even more amazing feat. His third shot on the 578-yard opening hole at Prestwick found the bottom of the cup. That swing was every bit as miraculous as Gene Saracen's legendary shot heard round the world in the 1935 Masters. Scores as low as Tommy's 149 were unthinkable in his age and for decades afterwards. His performance was highlighted by an opening 12 holes completed in a mind-boggling 47 strokes. That's an average of 3.9 strokes per hole. It was the first time in the history of competition that a player had completed a round in an average of under 4s. That score we think of today as under par. The concept of par, the score a first-rate golfer is expected to make on a given hole, didn't exist in Tommy's day. Even after the dawn of a new century and the invention of a ball that flew much farther, turning in a score under par in a championship was phenomenally rare. Tommy's winning score would never be matched as long as the championship was played at 36 holes, a period of 22 years, despite dramatic improvements in balls, clubs, and greenkeeping. The great golf writer Bernard Darwin, who spent a career following legends like Harry Vardon and Bobby Jones, wrote that if he could go back in time, there is no performance he would rather see than Tommy's magical 36 holes at Prestwick on that September afternoon in 1870. There must, he wrote, have been one very great golfer in those days. Tommy kept right on playing at that level for 5 unforgettable seasons. My book is the first to document his career record in tournaments, singles matches, and foursomes. It shows that Tommy won 6 of every 10 professional events in which he competed. That is a record few in the history of this game can rival, much less surpass. Even the great Tiger Woods has won just 24% of his tournaments. Tommy's sterling record is the reason every golfer of his era who bothered to record his thoughts, a list that includes Andrew Kirkcaldy, his rival Bob Ferguson of Musselburgh, and the remarkable St. Andrews amateur Leslie Balfour Melville, considered Tommy the greatest golfer they had ever seen or ever would see. Tommy's genius for golf wasn't his only contribution to this game, however. He also represented a radically new idea of what a professional golfer could be at a time when caddies and ball makers were considered wastrels whose only loves were golf and whiskey. Professionals might have resented being called wastrels if they knew what the word meant, but they would never have denied that their first loves were a brisk round and a wee nip. Unlike his brethren, Tommy was a well-educated man. His parents, at considerable expense, had arranged for him to attend the prestigious Ayr Academy, then and now considered one of the great schools in Scotland. Having studied alongside the sons of wealthy merchants, Tommy would never accept the prevailing notion that he was in some way inferior to those in the upper classes. His education had formed him into a forward-thinking man of his time. Massive social changes wrought by the Industrial Revolution made progress and self-improvement watchwords of that age. Those themes were preached even from the pulpit on Sundays. Tommy could never have imagined himself living the way every other professional of his era did. He had a different idea of his place in the world. His fellow caddies and ball makers earned their keep by grinding away at the golf shop's workbench or by hauling a gentleman's clubs around the links for a few shillings a day, stooping to tee up his ball for every drive. Tommy certainly worked in his father's shop occasionally, especially when he was a young man. But there was no evidence that he ever served as a gentleman's caddy. Tommy wanted to make his living playing the game, and he did so in a way no golfer could have dreamed possible. In Tommy's day, 7 out of 10 working Scots earned less than £30 sterling a year. Tommy earned more than half that amount in a single month in 1868 when he was just 17 years old by winning the Open and 2 other tournaments. At his peak, as documented by historians David Malcolm and Peter Crabtree, Tommy would earn £200 in a single season. That is 4 times what his father made as custodian of the links at St. Andrews. Tommy had essentially completed the work begun by men like his father and Allen Robertson. He had become the first truly professional golfer, as we understand the meaning of that word today. These days, we think of a professional as someone who is expert at his craft. In Tommy's age, the word had a decided negative connotation. It distinguished the landed gentry from those who had to scrape for a living. Young Tommy's enormous success and the fame it generated helped to create new opportunities for professional golfers of his own era and all of those who followed him. The number of professional tournaments held annually during Tommy's lifetime nearly doubled. Prize money did too. It was possible even then to foresee a day when every professional could make his living the way Tommy mostly did, by playing the game. Andrew Kirkcaldy, the caddy who grew up imitating Tommy, lived to see these changes unfolding. He saw the great Harry Vardon earn a staggering £4,000 from one of his journeys to America, and he saw a fellow professional, John Henry Taylor, who began his working life as a bootblack, send his own son to Oxford. Tommy's background, along with his transcendent play, also enabled him to establish an entirely different relationship with gentlemen who ruled golf in the 1970s. In the 19th century. Professionals in that era, Tommy included, earned much of their income by playing as a gentleman's foursome partner in big money matches. These matches occurred regularly at every club. When a gentleman called for them, professionals were expected to drop whatever they were doing and head for the links. They played for tips from gentlemen, and naturally, tips tended to be far more generous if their side won the match. Tommy was not prepared to play by those rules. Gentlemen who wanted him as a partner understood that the nation's undisputed king of clubs was to be paid handsomely, whether their side won or lost. Honestly, it was not that big of a gamble, because if Tommy was your partner, you almost always won. That might seem simply a champion asserting his privilege. But in a class-conscious society like Victorian Scotland, it was more than that. By understanding his own worth and driving his own bargain, Tommy had taken the bold first step on the very long road toward elevating the lowly status of professional golfers. Wherever golf was played, Tommy was well known as a man who spoke his mind freely, kowtowed to no one, and paid about as much attention to Victorian social conventions as he did to maxims about how golf ought to be played. Tommy made up his own mind and went his own way. The most striking example is his marriage to Margaret Drinnan, who worked as a housemaid to a wealthy couple in St. Andrews. Margaret was a dark-haired beauty with a forbidden past, a coal miner's daughter from West Lothian, the nation's industrial heartland. She had born a child out of wedlock, ordinarily a ruinous event for a woman in Victorian Scotland. It isn't clear if anyone in the Morris family, or St. Andrews, knew about Margaret's baby, which had died weeks after birth. Whether it was known or not, Tommy surely would have understood that in class-conscious St. Andrews, marrying a woman considered so far below his social station would be frowned upon. But he paid no mind. Tommy made that clear by renting he and his bride a swanky home that went for a princely £28 a year. Victorians would have considered that a vulgar display of newfound wealth for a person of Tommy's station. By now you must be wondering, what did gentlemen golfers think of all this? Tommy's cockiness on the course, Tommy's insistence on setting his own terms and forging his own path on life, Tommy's habit of spending lavishly and occasionally behaving as if he were the man equal to men considered far above his station. Gentlemen golfers no doubt thought Tommy was just a bit full of himself. But if they had any reaction beyond a raised eyebrow, it has yet to be discovered. Tommy, it seems, had that rarest of gifts, a personality so winning that whatever he did, all sins were forgiven. Not only that, he was a superstar, and in every age, we have tended to overlook the shortcomings of our superstars. Tommy's foursome partners included the leading gentlemen golfers of the age, men like Gilbert Mitchell Innes and John White Melville. Mitchell Innes is the man who proposed that Prestwick invite St. Andrews and Musselburgh to join in hosting the Open. White Melville is the most influential and beloved figure in the history of the Royal and Ancient Golf Club. Another gentleman from East Lothian, R.J.B. Tate, remembered sharing a hotel room with Tommy while he was at Loughness for a tournament. The two of them spent the evening playing iron shots for pennies from a hearthrug into a hat they had sitting on top of a bed. What those relationships suggest is that Victorian gentlemen respected Tommy for being his own man, a new breed of professional golfer for a new industrial age. That truth is reinforced by the letter James Denham wrote to those 60 golfing societies, offering them an opportunity to contribute to Tommy's memorial. Tommy, Denham wrote, and I'm quoting here, was widely known and universally admired for his honest and manly exertions by which he rose to the first place in the golfing world, and for his frank and courteous conduct toward all classes, which made him respected wherever golf was played. Those are telling words: frank and courteous, universally admired, respected wherever golf was played. Tommy may have been a provocateur. He may have thumbed his nose at convention and marched to his own drummer, but he was as beloved as any figure in the history of this game. If he hadn't been, there would be no monument to his memory on hallowed ground at the home of golf. It was paid to the golf gentlemen played at the spring and autumn meetings of clubs like the Royal and Ancient or the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers. Even then, the coverage focused as much as on the lords and ladies on hand as it did on the competition for silver clubs or gold medals conducted during the meetings. Honestly, it was more like society news than sports reporting. But that began to change with the institution of the Open. It was the first competition to be covered by the English press. Why? Because London gamblers wanted to bet on the outcome. And that should have come as no surprise. Gambling has always been the lifeblood of golf. Club members rarely set out on a foursome without staking a crown on the match. And they bet far more if both gentlemen had a professional as a partner. Every spring and autumn meeting featured high-profile matches between prominent professionals that gave members yet another chance to lay down a wager. Gambling was so much a part of life that clubs like the Honourable Company kept bet books, recording every wager members made. I have no doubt that those were handy documents to have if members got into a beef that had made after a few bottles of claret. Tommy's scintillating run to capture the belt ratcheted the interest of London gamblers and the English press up to an entirely new level. In the year leading up to his historic victory at Prestwick, reporters dogged Tommy's every step as he took a training tour south of the border. He played at Royal Liverpool on the northwest coast, Royal Blackheath in London, and Westward Ho in North Devon. The impact of Tommy's trip became almost immediately apparent. In the spring of 1872, after Tommy had claimed the belt, but before the Open resumed, Royal Liverpool staged the first major professional golf tournament conducted on English soil. The club offered an extraordinary purse of £55, with 15 to the winner. That was the largest prize that had yet been offered, more than twice as much as the Open. Even more remarkably, Royal Liverpool agreed to pay the travel expenses for every professional golfer who competed. That was unheard of. It spoke volumes about how far professional golf had already come. Not to mention how determined the club was to attract the game's biggest star, young Tom Morris. Not surprisingly, Tommy and every other leading golfer traveled south to compete. It would be the first demonstration of the pivotal role Royal Liverpool would play in the growth of English golf. Years later, the club would start the Amateur Championship and the international matches that would evolve into the Walker Cup. Among those who followed in all that afternoon as Tommy won, yet again, was a 10-year-old boy named John Ball Jr. He would make his mark in golf 18 years later at Prestwick by becoming the first amateur and the first Englishman to win the Open. His score, incidentally, was a full 15 strokes higher than young Tom's immortal 149 a generation earlier. Nevertheless, Ball's victory in 1890 ranks with Tommy's claiming of the belt as one of the most transformative in history. It stoked the fire for golf that had been smoldering south of the border since 1864. That was the year the first truly English club was founded at Westward Ho in North Devon. London's Blackheath was far older, of course, but it was patronized almost exclusively by Scots in the royal court. Tommy's triumphant appearance at Royal Liverpool only redoubled the interest of the English press. By the time the claret jug was purchased 5 months later and Tommy became champion golfer for the 4th time in succession, the young superstar's exploits were being covered by the field literally shot by shot. Old Tom's first biographer, William Weir Tulloch, was so impressed by this development that he reprinted one of those articles in his book as proof of the remarkable attention golf was then receiving. The tipping point for golf's popularity came in 1873. That was the year Tommy played 2 epic singles matches against his best friend and fiercest rival, Davie Strath. They made a dashing pair, those two. Gallant young superstars who dressed like dandies and were known to live a fast life. Their styles presented a study in contrast. Tommy's slashing bravado versus Davie's smooth, silky swing. They had been battling one another since they were teenagers, mostly over 18 or 36 holes. Davie had justly earned a reputation as the only golfer capable of making the young champion fight for his money. Now, with both players in their prime, they would play their first great matches. Each would be a marathon featuring 3 days of 36 holes apiece over the links of St. Andrews, 216 holes in all. The timing could not have been more exquisite. Tommy was at the absolute peak of his powers. But for the past year, Davie had been seen to be closing in on his friend. He'd beaten Tommy in a tournament at Carnoustie and a ballyhooed foursome at St. Andrews. Their matches in 1873 was hyped for the Victorian age as the Ollie Fraser boxing extravaganzas would be in another age, especially in England. The Daily News and the Times of London both sent reporters to St. Andrews to wire daily dispatches on the outcome. Even the Ladies' Home Journal kept its genteel readers up to date on what they called the madness surrounding the great St. Andrews golf match. Thousands of people swarmed the links to follow their action, and betting on the matches reached inconceivable levels. Newspapers reported that £2,000 was wagered on the second match. That is a staggering sum for that era. It's twice as much as a successful man might leave in his estate after a lifetime of work. £600 were bet in Liverpool alone. The matches could not have unfolded in more dramatic fashion. Tommy and Davie waged a pitched battle from the outset, characterized by spectacular shots and phenomenal scoring. During the first match in July, Davie came out playing the most inspired golf of his life. He marched out to a posing 5-hole lead and held off Tommy's late charge to win by 3 holes. It's not hard to imagine the uproar that would have caused in the world of golf. Had the undisputed champion finally been dethroned? That question would be settled by a rematch the following month. By then, every golfer in the kingdom had heard that history was being made at St. Andrews, and hundreds of them came to join the throng following Tommy and Davie around the links. The second match began the same way as the first. Davie raced out to an imposing 5-hole lead. Every golfer in the crowd must have had his heart in his throat. But Tommy was not about to panic, and he was not about to be beaten twice in succession by any man alive. Relentlessly, he dug in and started to produce the magic that had won him 4 consecutive Opens. He holed one miraculous putt after another over St. Andrews' massive, undulating greens. It clearly unnerved Davie. He stumbled in with his worst round of either match, a 90. Tommy wiped out Davie's big lead and went on to win by 4 holes. He'd proven yet again that he was Scotland's once and forever king of clubs. Those great matches would be remembered as the finest display of golf the game had seen in its first 4 centuries. They were played at a time when winning scores in the annual professional tournament at St. Andrews tended to be in the mid to high 80s. Only 4 men, Alan Robertson, Old Tom, Jamie Anderson, and Young Tommy, had ever come in with a score lower than 80 over the links. Yet in 12 rounds, both Tommy and Davie came in with 5 rounds of 84 or less. Davie raced through 9 holes in 39 strokes, not once but twice, and Tommy had 3 9s of 40. After 216 holes, they had taken precisely the same number of strokes, 1,027, an average of 85.5 strokes per round. So nearly every one of those dozen rounds might have been good enough to win the annual professional tournament at the home of golf. Those 2 great matches also marked the moment when golf stopped being a mere Scottish pastime and took its place as a sport that would become increasingly popular throughout Britain. The towering fame Tommy had achieved helped launch the great English golf boom, along with his tour south of the border. That period of dramatic growth in the game would be further fueled by John Ball's breakthrough victory at Prestwick in 1890. In the early part of the century, only 2 golf clubs existed in England, and even there the game was played still mainly by immigrant Scots. By the time Tommy won the belt, the number of clubs had risen to 22. Before the new century dawned, England had more than 1,000 golf clubs. That meant the game's place on the sports pages and its future as a worldwide spectator sport both were assured. No one could have known it then, but those matches in the summer of 1873 would represent the last great achievement of Tommy's storied career. It was during that same year that Tommy fell in love with Margaret. By the autumn of 1874, they would be married and living in that spectacular home Tommy had rented for them not far from his parents' place on North Street. As that year drew to a close, the couple would learn that Margaret was pregnant. With his mind on courting Margaret, Tommy's game had suffered. He finished 3rd in the Open Championship in 1873, the first held at St. Andrews, and 2nd the following year at Musselburgh. Once he and Margaret had settled into their new life, Tommy returned to form. He won 2 professional tournaments in 1875 and teamed up with his father to compete in a much-hyped match of 4 Open champions at North Berwick against Willie and Mungo Park. That match took Tommy away from St. Andrews just as Margaret was reaching the end of her pregnancy. It was at North Berwick, as Tommy and his father stood triumphant on the final green, having vanquished the Parks, that the young superstar was handed a telegram. It said Margaret was struggling in childbirth and that Tommy should return to St. Andrews immediately. Old Tom and his son made a desperate nighttime sail for home across the Firth of Forth, only to discover that Tommy's wife and son had died during the torturous labor. Tommy would never recover from that blow. He would play only one more significant match, a 12-round marathon against the famed amateur Arthur Molesworth. Tommy won easily, despite conceding Arthur 6 strokes in each round and competing in frigid, snowy winter weather. Just a few dreary weeks after that, his father would find Tommy dead in his bed on Christmas morning. The main artery to his heart had burst during the night. He was just 24 years old. St. Andrews, and every other town where the game was played, was plunged into mourning. They had lost the pride of the whole golfing world, as old Tom's biographer put it. On the day of Tommy's funeral, every shop in St. Andrews closed and no golf was played on the links. Under gloomy skies, his hearse was followed to the cathedral burial ground by golfers from throughout the kingdom, leading members of the Royal and Ancient, a future Prime Minister, the Provost of St. Andrews, and every member of the town council. Across Scotland, men felt moved to do something to preserve the memory of their gallant young superstar, a man whose impact on the game would be matched only by the likes of Harry Vardon, Arnold Palmer, and Tiger Woods. The monument to Tommy in the Cathedral Cemetery at St. Andrews would be the most lasting and visible tribute, but it would not be the only one. Soon after Tommy's death, the Chamber's Edinburgh Journal published an elegy to Scotland's champion golfer. Its 9 stanzas include these. Beneath the sod poor Tommy's laid, now bunkered fast for good and all. A finer golfer never played a further or a surer ball. Among the monarchs of the green, for long he held imperial sway, and none the starred and end between could match with Tommy on his day. Thrice belted knight of peerless skill, again we see him head the fray, and memory loves to reckon still the feats of Tommy in his day. I thank you for your kind attention, and now I'd be delighted to take any questions that you may have.